Welcome, friends. What better time than now to gather to talk about policing? We are a few days after an unprecedented trial and conviction of a police officer who murdered a man pleading for mercy, for humanity. George Floyd's life was stolen, terminated. We can only hope he is in a realm beyond our knowing, in a peace beyond our understanding. Within minutes of the verdict, a teenaged girl was shot and killed by an officer shown in a harrowing body cam that includes an image of a black man kicking a young black woman while she was lying on the ground. The complexity of the issues we face demand so much more than the crushing violence of a police force trained to kill when they do not understand what they see. Welcome to this effort to peel back the covers on the deadly practices that perpetuate systemic oppressions rooted in our history and normative in their destructive power. Welcome to this essential conversation. Riverside is honored to partner with Justice Aid and to support the PACE program of the Neighborhood Defender Service. I'm Michael Livingston, the Interim Senior Minister here at Riverside. Let us pray. God of many names and forms, be among us in these moments of song, spirit, and challenge, this call to action. Let those who speak share their wisdom, their experience, their passion for changing the structures that demean, devalue, and destroy human lives. Let those who listen deepen their knowledge and be inspired to continue to make what we know of as policing today a relic of an empire whose only hope of transformation lies in the leadership of the very communities it has exploited since before its founding. Amen. Amen.
With heartfelt thanks to all in the Riverside Church community for allowing us to be in this hallowed space for the third time, Justice Aid is glad to welcome everyone to this vital conversation on racism and policing. The police system is not broken. It is working exactly to its intended purpose of protecting property and privilege. Over-policing devalues and punishes minority lives and minority communities. Policing is protected by privilege, and privilege is what policing protects. This is dead wrong.
Sherrilyn Ifill has spent her entire legal career fighting for civil rights. First as an ACLU fellow, litigating voting rights cases, then as a constitutional law professor, and now as the 7th Director-Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization founded by Thurgood Marshall and responsible for the legal strategy resulting in the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Sherrilyn is one of the foremost strategists on complex issues of racial justice and is unrelenting in her charge for racial equality and civil rights. It is therefore no surprise that her voice shines through on issues of racism and policing. Justice Aid and the Riverside Church welcome civil rights warrior Sherrilyn Ifill.
Hello, my name is Sherrilyn Ifill, and I'm the President and Director-Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which I call the nation's premier civil rights legal organization founded by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. I'm honored to be part of this Justice Aid event today and really grateful to Justice Aid and to Riverside Church for asking me to speak. I will tell you that I wrestled with what I should say to you today. And in the end, I decided I should speak from the heart, because this has been a very, very challenging period. Not only because the work that we do at the Legal Defense Fund has been so unrelenting last year through addressing voter suppression, last year through a nationwide protest after the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, but really just in the last few weeks. I think we were maybe unprepared for how trying it would be to watch the trial of the officer who killed George Floyd and to relive those moments, to hear and to have a real sense of the deep trauma experienced by the witnesses and by members of our community, multiplying, by so many exponential numbers, the Darnella Frasers and the 9-year-old and the EMS worker and all of those people who were traumatized watching this killing and watching the city of Minneapolis go through this trying period. But even as that trial was unfolding, as you know, other unarmed Black people were killed by police officers, including a 13-year-old boy in Chicago, Adam Toledo. As a matter of fact, we watched a week of multiple children being killed by police around the country. And the accumulated weight of that very much sat with me as I waited for the verdict in the Floyd case. What was most disturbing for me was when we heard that the jury had reached a verdict, and we were now waiting for about, an hour and a half until the jury returned so that we could hear what the verdict would be. The heaviness that I think so many of us felt, not just me, the anxiety, the sense that we weren't sure what was going to happen. I will say it was a powerful moment of shaming, not for me personally, but shaming, in my view, for our profession, the legal profession, and for our country. We weren't certain what the outcome would be. We weren't certain because we saw the officer who killed Philando Castile not far away from where George Floyd was killed several years ago. We saw him acquitted. We saw the jury hung in the case of the officer who chased down Walter Scott in that park in North Charleston and shot him. We saw no charges brought against the officer who killed Eric Garner. We saw the acquittal of Officer Betty Shelby, who killed Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and on and on and on. And for me, all the way back to when I was a 10-year-old girl growing up in New York City in Queens, and an NYPD officer shot a boy who was also 10, Clifford Glover. That was my first exposure to the issue of police violence against unarmed African Americans, the shooting of a boy who was the same age as me, and the story of that shooting never left me, and it's been decades. And I felt the accumulated weight of all of that as we waited for the verdict in the case of the officer who killed George Floyd. And it reminded me of how much weight we are carrying because of the ongoing reality of racial injustice in our criminal legal system. It's a weight that I think burdens us, even those of us who do this work, who confront it every day, and who are often very clear-eyed. I like to think about it. We have no illusions. We wake up every day prepared to work to try to make change. But that day, there was a heaviness that I felt for sure. And when the guilty verdict came back, like many of you, I was gratified. I was happy. In fact, it was hard for me to imagine what I would have done had the jury been hung, or worse, had Officer Chauvin been acquitted of what we all saw on that video. But what I also found was that when the verdict came back, guilty, 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 it didn't bring a sense of relief. It brought a sense that, yes, it needed to happen in that case, but I was mindful of the fact that this was a case in which we had a 9-minute video watching the torturous killing of a man on the street. We had a circle of witnesses who watched and who testified at the trial. We had police officers willing to testify against a police officer. These are the rare ingredients in cases when there are police killings of unarmed Black people. And so I was aware that although there was a guilty verdict in the case, this was a most unusual case. I was thankful for the family of George Floyd and for the community. I was thankful also that the age-old tactics of demonizing the victim, of suggesting somehow that George Floyd brought his own death on himself, that those tactics in which the Black victim is somehow treated as some superhuman threat, the tactics that were used in the Rodney King case and the Eric Garner case and so many others didn't work. I was gratified. But I also was freshly aware of the weight we carry, of how much more there is to do. And that's what I want to say a word to you about today, and then leave you to the rest of this important conversation. Many of us have been working on issues of policing for a very long time, and we have seen it all. But I do think we are at a very different moment in policing in this country, in law enforcement in this country. We are at the moment where we realize that the system is fundamentally broken, that reforming it around the edges won't work. And while that is a very heavy reality to face, in it is also an extraordinary opportunity. We have an opportunity to reimagine what public safety should be like. We have an opportunity to imagine what it would mean to have a public safety regime that was not imposed violently on our communities, but that emanated from our communities and that tapped into the resources of our communities. A public safety system that had built into it the humanity and dignity of Black people, that recognizes Black children as children, that treats those suffering from mental illness as people who are suffering from mental illness and need help, that does not make homelessness a rationale for violence or for killing. We have the opportunity to think afresh about what we really want and to build towards it. Now, many people will say that this or that tactic won't work. And the truth is, none of them will work independently. It's going to require us bringing all our talents to bear. It's going to require us imagining a new public safety system, funding a new public safety system, testing and trying, failing and trying again, convincing ourselves of what we can do, ensuring that we shore up the resources in our community so that we can lessen the imprint and the footprint of law enforcement in our daily interactions. But it's also going to require us, in the meantime, to ensure that we have built in transparency and accountability for those who operate in our current public safety system or our current law enforcement system. And so it's going to be important for us to do more than one thing at a time. We're going to have to build something new while we also insist on standards, transparency, and accountability in the existing system. This is going to be challenging and difficult, but I think this is the time like never before. I think we have never been in a place in this country in which so many people can see how broken the system is and the toll that it takes on us as a community and in our country. And so I'm encouraging you to keep an open mind, to be prepared to tap into our deepest creativity and imagination as we think about what comes next, but also to be unafraid to step into the unknown and to try new things, to recognize that sometimes the worst happens to show us that we have to be courageous to step into something new and fresh. At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we're prepared to do that. Our Justice in Public Safety project is working on a number of fronts to shore up community groups, to shore up new ideas and new thinking about public safety, but also to pass critical legislation that will hold officers who engage in misconduct accountable. Also to ensure that we use the resources of the legal system to protect against unconstitutional policing. All of those things have to happen at the same time. You're going to hear more today from those who've been doing this work. I'm very grateful to you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I want you to be encouraged in a sober way. This is a very sobering subject, but to be encouraged to believe that we can build something better. This is our civil rights moment. This is our civil rights issue. And if we pull together and work on it with the expectation that we will make change, I believe that we can. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today, and I look forward to engaging with many of you in the weeks and months ahead. Take good care.
In the spirit of beloved community, I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Cameron Van Patterson, father and Justice Aid Board member, and I am pleased to introduce Representative Cori Bush, the U.S. Congressional Representative from the 1st District of Missouri, which includes St. Louis. Representative Bush is a lifelong advocate for social justice. Her interest in politics began after the 2014 protests in Ferguson, which was a pivotal moment in the Black Lives Matter movement, in which she worked as a triage nurse and organizer. Additionally, Representative Bush is a pastor and a Nonviolence 365 ambassador with the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Finally, I want you to know how honored we are to be joined by Representative Bush for this fiercely urgent conversation about police accountability, racial justice, and the structural transformation of policy and practice throughout our criminal legal system. Please join me in welcoming Representative Cori Bush.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Cori Bush, and I am so proud to be joining you as the St. Louis Congresswoman. Thank you so much to each and every single one of you for coming together in community today. I have the honor and privilege of representing Missouri's 1st District in Congress, the district where I was born and raised. Like many communities in this country, my community in St. Louis is struggling under the weight of community violence because of decades-long policies that have inflicted harm on our people and left our neighborhoods under-resourced. St. Louis leads the nation in police killings, a heartbreaking and gut-wrenching reality that must be solved urgently. As a politicist, a politician, and an activist, I often reimagine a society that loves humanity, cares for its communities, and truly keeps our children safe. A world in which we remove police officers and metal detectors from our schools and invest in more nurses and guidance counselors. A world where we stop criminalizing sex workers, the unhoused, people with mental illness and substance use disorders, and one where we instead guarantee that every person in America can live a joyous and a decent life. As Vice Chair of the House Judiciary Committee on Crime, I will continue to work in partnership with my community and my fellow Congress members to ensure that we reduce harm and dismantle systemic and racial injustice wherever it exists in our country. It is a moral imperative that we lead with radical love to demand and deliver justice. It is that radical love that I carry with me in the halls of Congress, and it is in the spirit of that love that I invite you to join me. Let's lock our arms together and carry on in our struggle to help with bending the arc of the moral universe a little more towards justice today and every day. Because with love in our hearts, we will transform our world, and the sky will not even be our limit.
Hello, I'm Heather Pinckney, and I serve on the board of Justice Aid. Each year, we work to raise awareness around a pressing issue of justice, and we partner with another organization that is doing effective work in that area. This year, our focus is police accountability, and we are honored to introduce you to our 2021 grantee partner, Neighborhood Defender Services, located in Harlem and Detroit. NDS is the gold standard in community-based and holistic public defense. They seek to ensure that the police and prosecutors can no longer cycle Black and brown people through the criminal legal system, destroying families and neighborhoods in the process. They address not only a client's pending criminal charges, but also the other issues that stem from a single contact with police: mental health, education, eviction, job loss, deportation, family separation, and police misconduct in general. In the collective fight against racism in policing, their experience is invaluable. Now we are going to show a video that we've put together with the help of some of our trusted voices at NDS.
Where I grew up, we were taught the police were your friends. You know, if you need something, turn to the police.
The earliest police forces were slave patrols, designed to capture and return black people to their white owners. Centuries later, white Americans feel safe with police, while black and brown people still feel hunted.
Most white people, the only time they've ever been stopped by the police is when they were speeding. They got a ticket and they went on their way, paid it, and that was the end of it. To be black in a majority black neighborhood in this country means that you have regular, ongoing interactions with the police. You're stopped in the street, you're stopped in your car, you are questioned, you are suspicious. Just by virtue of being you, you're suspicious. And that is just a different way of living than it is to have the privilege of having the police there to protect you.
Black Americans make up just 13% of the population, yet nearly half of people arrested for misdemeanors in New York City are black. Once brought into the system, 90% of those arrested are too poor to pay for a lawyer. Federal law requires that everyone receive legal representation. For those without resources, a public defender is often the only one standing between a poor person of color and the well-funded, all-encompassing force of the prosecution.
Once you're in the system, it impacts your life in every direction. If the arrest is drug-related and you're living in New York City housing, they will evict you, your family, and bar you forever. If the incident happened in your home and a child was there, an ACS claim will immediately be filed. They will try to take your children away.
One thing that I think shocks people when they go into court for the first time in Manhattan, and I'm sure many other places as well, is just how sort of in your face the racism is.
You could sit in criminal court for a morning in lower Manhattan and just watch in front of you the destruction of the black family. You could watch arraignments and see black and brown bodies, male bodies largely, being sort of marched through the system. And you could sit there for an hour and you can see them being shackled and cuffed and taken through the system and charged and then taken back into holding cells and then off to jail and prison. And if you leave there and go across the street and sit in family court, you'll watch young black and brown kids being ripped from their parents, being ripped from their mothers, also put into and lost in the foster care system. And then if you spend an hour in housing court, you will see black people being evicted in large numbers from their homes for behavior and for activity that white folks don't get evicted for. So, you know, it's 400 years of this, and it's as it ever was. We're right where we started.
Black people have always told of the dangers they face at the hands of law enforcement and the criminal system. But without pressure from those with money and power, the system does not change. The murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor seem to trigger a reaction from Americans across a wider spectrum. Many are starting to question how policing is done, how much it costs, and how, as a system, it is failing.
Police, fire, and medical.
Every time someone reaches out for help in a public safety way, they're not looking for a badge or a gun response. Most times when people call, they would just want help for a loved one. They want somebody who can come and actually be helpful. Not someone who's going to hit them over the head, or not someone who's going to arrest them, or not someone who's going to kill them, someone who's going to help them.
A good example is the family who calls the police because they have a member of their family who is mentally ill and behaving irrationally, and they don't have any place else to turn. And so they call 911 and the police come. And we've all seen on the news horrible stories in these situations where the police have a very bad encounter with this person out in the community and has led to death in some cases.
I'm gonna shoot you! I'm gonna shoot you! Shot fired, shot fired, shot fired!
They simply are not equipped to do that work.
I'm out by myself, God damn it, man.
And what reallocation of those resources means is let's give the right people the resources to go out and handle those responsibilities.
American communities spend nearly $2 trillion each year on policing and incarceration that leaves people more likely to return to the system. Reallocation could create a path for healing in families and communities.
It costs over $800 a day to keep somebody in custody at Rikers Island. Over the course of a year, if you took $800, cut it in half. If you took $400 and invested that amount of money into each of the people that you have locked up over the course of time on Rikers Island, and worked on stable housing, education, job placement, providing treatment facilities, whatever treatments are necessary to have somebody be able to have a stable life, what is the likelihood that they are going to go back to jail? It's so small. It's so small. And if ultimately the goal is, public safety, you've created it.
Black and brown people in this country live daily with the terror of a system created with a racist agenda that's never been dismantled. If America is to be a country of justice, the rights written in law must apply to everyone.
My son is Black, and the simple fact is that he has a 1 in 3 chance of going to jail and a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by the police because of the color of his skin. I want him, to be able to just walk down the street with a group of his friends, and act like a kid. That's my wildest dream, which doesn't feel like it should be a wild dream, but really still is.
Justice is about breaking down the systems and the structure that oppress and deny, and recreating and reimagining systems that open the doors. That's all that anybody really wants is family and opportunity and loved one and some security. And that's really what justice is a system that's open to everybody to live that kind of life.
I'm Therese Steiner, board member of Justice Aid, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Angela J. Davis, who will moderate our panel on racist policing in communities and schools. Professor Davis is a distinguished professor of law at the American University Washington College of Law, where her work focuses on prosecutorial power and racism in the criminal justice system. Professor Davis is a multi-award-winning scholar, educator, and author. She is a recipient of the DC Bar's Thurgood Marshall Award and the American University Scholar Teacher of the Year Award, among others. Professor Davis is the author of Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, and her most recent book is Policing the Black Man: Arrest, Prosecution, and Imprisonment. Professor Davis.
Thank you, Therese. There is no issue more important and more in need of correction in our criminal legal system than the over-policing of Black and brown communities. Black and brown men, women, and children are stopped, frisked, harassed, assaulted, beaten, and killed because of the color of their skin. This has been going on since the time of slavery and has persisted throughout our history up until the present day. And in no year has this awful phenomenon been more in the forefront of the conscience of this nation than this past year, with the brutal killings of Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and George Floyd. Rarely, if ever, are these police officers held accountable for their misconduct, even when they kill. The killer of George Floyd is one of the few officers who was ever charged with a crime. And at the time of this recording, he stands trial for George Floyd's murder as the whole world watches, waiting to see if justice will be done. Today, we are fortunate to have three extraordinary leaders who will discuss and shed light on this issue with a particular focus on the overpolicing of Black and Brown youth and the role of public defenders in the empowerment of communities and holding police accountable. Because of time constraints, I will only be able to briefly introduce them and won't be able to tell you about all of their great accomplishments and all of the great work that they're doing. So I urge you to read their full bios. First, Professor Kristen Henning. Professor Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law School. She's one of the nation's leading experts on juvenile justice and the overpolicing of Black and Brown youth. And she's the author of the forthcoming book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. We'll also hear from Sally Lee, who is the founder and executive director of Teachers Unite, an organization of public school educators in New York City that collaborates with youth and parents to transform public schools. And finally, we'll hear from Rick Jones, who is the executive director and a founding member of the Neighborhood Defender Service, one of the nation's leading defender agencies and a national leader in the defender community. Chris, I actually want to start with you because actually statistics show that Black and Brown youth are more policed than any other group, even more than Black and Brown adults. Can you talk to us a bit about the impact of this overpolicing on our young people?
So yes, Angela, I think that most of us know intuitively that policing has a traumatic effect on people of color, right? And particularly given what you just said, that the country watched and is now rewatching George Floyd killed before our very eyes by a police officer. But what I think most people don't really understand is, one, how pervasive and multifaceted that trauma is in communities of color. And as you noted, I don't think most people know the unique ways in which policing impacts adolescents and children of color, Black youth in particular. And as a result, most of us don't know how incredibly ineffective many of our current policing practices are in school and with youth more generally. So let's just start with that first point. So when I talk about this notion of policing as traumatic, I want people to think beyond the extreme examples of brutality and to understand the other sources of police trauma. Those of us who live and work in heavily policed communities of color know that many police encounters involve some sort of physical contact, like grabbing, pushing, shoving, pulling, tackling suspects to the ground. And once on the ground, Black and Brown citizens, right, who are deemed to be suspect, are often held down by multiple officers who sit on them, lie on them, kick them, punch them, or mace them. And so then there is this psychological trauma that is even more pervasive than the physical contact. And that is the trauma that arises from the routine police presence in a community. So police cars that are parked on the street corner, routine stops and frisks, young people being told to lift their shirts and show their waistband to see if they're carrying any weapons. And so the young people that I represent in Washington, D.C., live with the pervasive sense that they are constantly under surveillance. And what's fascinating is that there is a growing body of research documenting this extraordinary trauma that policing imposes on Black and Brown children at one of the most important times in their development. Adolescents who have been the target of excessive stops and frisks by the police report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, meaning that they are always on guard, right? Not trusting the police and also not trusting other state actors. At times, they become withdrawn, distracted. They can't concentrate in school They become angry or aggressive, and at times they turn to alcohol or drugs. So in this way, policing, this sort of aggressive policing of youth of color increases crime and not decreases crime. And what's so powerful about this research is that trauma, it shows that trauma occurs not only from being the target of police aggression, the direct target of police aggression, but also from witnessing and hearing about police aggression from family, friends, or someone who's close to them. Even watching police brutality, like watching George Floyd on the internet or TV, involving people that we don't know, is just as traumatic as being there. And so there's this significant association, for example, between these, what they call traumatic events online, these traumatic police brutality and depression. Young people experience and re-experience those events as if they were there. And it's important to recognize that this sort of vicarious contact with the police produces the same kind of stress. Just having to worry about being a young person who has to worry about being the victim of police violence is in and of itself a source of stress. And the consequences are real for young people. It affects young people's sleep patterns, their self-esteem, their perceptions about the legitimacy of the police, their perceptions about the law itself, and the long-term, and it affects their long-term physical health. And to just make this real for a second, as a defense attorney, I've been representing children for 25 years. And I tell you, I have always been amazed by how many of my clients I see sleeping in the hallway before a court hearing, not being able to focus on what we are there to do. But as I began really studying the traumatic effects of policing on adolescents, I realized that this isn't just the anxiety of having to come to court that one day, but it is the impact, the consequence of the long-term cumulative impact of stress associated with policing in communities of color. And so basically, young people who experience these types of police encounters also experience a significant disruption in their sleep patterns, meaning either that they can't sleep at all or that they have very poor sleep quality. And of course, we know that sleep disruption affects everybody's ability to focus and excel in school. And one of the most, and I'll just sort of close here to say that one of the most important ways policing affects youth during adolescence is in what we call identity development, meaning that negative experiences that teenagers have with the police early in life affects how they view the law and the law enforcement later. So degrading and dehumanizing encounters teach young people to fear and resent the police and to even question whether it's worth it to participate in mainstream society. So all of the reasons that we say we need police for public safety, for school safety, to maintain a productive learning environment in schools, we're actually not doing that with the hyper-surveillance and aggressive over-policing of Black and brown children. And so there's just so little evidence that police and schools are preventing crime. And in fact, we're showing that we're doing worse by our kids, criminalizing Black adolescents, referring kids to schools, increasing trauma. So it's a real issue for all of us to grapple with.
I was struck by the two young women when they testified, just being shown the photograph of that officer. A year ago, they saw this and they just burst, one of them burst into tears and cried, just recounting something that happened almost a year ago. So everything you say makes so much sense. And I look forward to reading more about it in your book. So thank you for that. And you mentioned schools. One of the places police officers most frequently come in contact with young people is in schools. Sally, I want to turn to you because your organization, Teachers Unite, is an ally in the youth-led movement for police-free schools. Why is it important that we have police-free schools? And can our children be safe in schools without police?
Thanks for the question. And for that background, Kristen. For a little bit of historical context, particularly for New York City, where I am, the push to police Black and brown young people in schools goes back 100 years. And really, we saw it be institutionalized in 1998 when Mayor Giuliani moved what's called the School Safety Agent Force, or SSAs, transferred them from being under the supervision and administration of what was then the Board of Education to the New York Police Department, the NYPD. And that force of SSAs is comprised of over 5,500 officers. That's larger than the police force of Houston, Texas. In New York City schools, we have about 2,800 guidance counselors, to give you a sense of the priorities and the differences and how we approach children who are supposed to be learning in our schools. 26% of New York City students are Black, yet 54% of all police interventions in schools are with Black students. 67% of all students in New York City public schools are Black and Latinx. 92% of all who are arrested are Black and Latinx. And so, as a response to these realities, which we see echoed across the country, and as Kristen laid out, the young people who are most directly impacted by this phenomenon, those young people are leading the movement to defund police in schools, right? That movement to defund the police is echoed and underscored in the movement to divest from police contracts and police budgets in school systems, and to divest from those while investing in supportive staff, such as guidance counselors, social workers, other resources that build a new paradigm of restorative justice and humanity and dignity in our schools. And so you're really seeing, I think, in communities and in schools, a questioning of, do police make us safe? Our members, Teachers Unite members, are incredible New York City public school educators who really take cue from abolitionist organizations such as Critical Resistance, who question that caging people makes us safe. And in fact, abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore speaks about abolition as being about presence and not absence. So when folks start to think, well, what if you take police away or take prisons away? Really, let's focus on what should be there. What is our vision for public schools and how they support and inspire and nourish young people? What could we be putting in? What could be there instead of policing in schools, which hasn't always been there? And so Teachers Unite, we're possibly the only educator organization in Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national coalition of over 100 organizations, mostly youth-led organizations, also parent organizations and advocate groups, really leading the work to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, as it's called. And our members speak alongside New York City young people to eliminate all forms of policing in schools and to advocate for youth advocates, peace builders, and that supportive staffing that we've been talking about. And our members also have been leaders in building a community of educators who are studying and trying to understand what restorative justice means and how to really make cultural and community shifts within their own schools that move away from punitive discipline and suspensions and exclusion, and towards an ethic of inclusion and community building. And to that end, we've been working with young people and parents on a participatory action research project to really reclaim definitions of safety and accountability. And we're excited that findings around that research will be coming out in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you so much for the work of Teachers Unite. Educators and students in schools are certainly in the best position to be able to speak on this issue. So thank you for your advocacy. Rick, in all of the discussions about over-policing, rarely do we hear the voices of public defenders, which I find odd. As a former public defender myself, I know that public defenders, represent the very people who are the victims of that over-policing. Public defenders know their clients, they know their families, they tell their stories, and of course, they represent them in court. And I know that your office has been lifting up the role of public defenders in empowering communities and holding police accountable. And you have this wonderful program called PACE, Police Accountability Community Empowerment. So I'd love it if you could tell us about the role of public defenders, the role that they can play, and the work that your office is doing.
Well, thank you for that question. And I'll try to follow on the heels of Chris and Sally, and also thanks to the folks at Justice Aid and Riverside Church for this really phenomenal forum. You know, the concept of public defense sort of stumbled out of Gideon's Gate and has only recently begun to gain its footing. And that's really true with so many initiatives geared toward the poor and historically oppressed. From inception, public defenders have been underfunded, under-resourced, underutilized, and unheard. In the last 58 years since Gideon, there's been an explosion in over-policing, over-criminalization, mass incarceration, mass deportation, the war on drugs, stop and frisk, evictions, homelessness, family separation, police in the schools, and the school-to-prison pipeline. All of these forms of systemic and structural racism could have certainly been mitigated, and some likely eliminated altogether, if we had had a robust, well-resourced, well-trained, client-centered, community-based, holistic, multi-forum system of public defense in every village and hamlet, in every city and county across this country, as we do with police and prosecutors. At NDS, 30 years of work challenging the police, litigating against prosecutors, and successfully navigating the courts, and more importantly, being proximate to our clients, proximate to their families, and proximate to the communities that we serve, has shown us the power of public defense. In 1968, Dr. Kenneth Clark testified before the Kerner Commission, which was investigating the riots and civil unrest in Chicago, in Detroit, and Newark. The Kerner Commission was investigating the riots and civil unrest in Detroit and Newark in 1967. But Dr. Clark testified about reading reports written on the riots in Chicago in 1919, and it having an Alice in Wonderland effect on him. He said, the same moving picture, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. 50 years and nothing had changed. That's how PACE was conceived, 52 years after the Kerner Commission report. We understand the history that successful civil rights movements in this country have three component parts: litigation, legislation, and community action. And NDS is experienced in all three, each building and supporting and nourishing the other. PACE, Police Accountability Community Empowerment, as you mentioned, Monty, is the next generation of thinking at NDS. And there are essentially three prongs to the NDS PACE program: transformative litigation, which is dismantling the racist structures of policing; change advocacy, identifying, uplifting, and achieving the best ideas of a reimagined society; and community empowered agency, healing, education, self-determination, shifting the balance of power. As many of you know, NDS was started in Harlem as a demonstration project in 1990. A group of public defenders came together from around the country, realizing that no matter how successful we were in criminal court, our clients were leaving us at the courthouse steps, facing the same challenges, obstacles, and hurdles that brought them into the legal system in the first place. And frequently, the criminal case was the most inconsequential matter of all. Mom gets arrested for petty larceny. And as a result, the government seeks to remove her children and put them into foster care. Dad gets arrested for an open container while walking home from work and winds up in deportation proceedings. Junior gets arrested in the lobby of grandma's building, and the government is now moving to evict grandma from the apartment where she's lived for 30 years and raised 2 generations of her family. We realized that mom, dad, grandma, and the entire family were more concerned with losing the kids, being deported, or losing the family home than whatever was going to happen in criminal court, in misdemeanor criminal court, really. And at the same time as these realizations were coming into focus, David Dinkins became the mayor of New York City, the first and only African-American mayor, if you can believe that, in New York City history. And more importantly, a mayor who understood the people, the families, and the communities in Northern Manhattan. So when this idea of NDS, client-centered, community-based, team defense was brought to him, he got it right away and gave us 5 years worth of seed money to test the model. And holistic public defense was born in Harlem. Of course, David Dinkins proved to be a one-term mayor and was followed by a guy named Rudy Giuliani. And as a result of that, NDS spent many years in the wilderness just trying to survive. And the only reason we did survive was thanks to the support of our clients, our families, and our neighbors in Northern Manhattan. Eventually, thanks to term limits, Mike Bloomberg became the mayor, and his administration at least understood the efficacy of what we were doing in Harlem. Fast forward a decade, and we now have the ability to represent more people in Harlem than ever before and have opened a second office in Detroit. But the mission and the vision of NDS has always been to test the model and expand. NDS PACE is the manifestation of that vision. We cannot let this dynamic moment in time go without bringing the full weight and experience of holistic public defense to bear on systems of injustice. We have the tools and the know-how to change the way policing happens in this country, to reimagine the way public safety works, to replace badge and gun impunity with care and repair solutions, to shift the balance of power in historically oppressed communities. We will not let this moment pass.
Thank you so much, Rick, for shedding light on the important role of public defenders in this movement in empowering communities and holding police accountable. You all do such important work to fight the harms caused by the over-policing of our communities, but everybody has a role to play. And so I'd love for each of you to talk about what we all can do, what our audience can do. And I'll start with you, Chris. Like, what would you say to members of our audience who want to take action to stop the over-policing of Black and Brown youth?
Yes. And so let me just start by saying thank you so much to Justice Aid and Riverside Church for calling for these action items, because Angela, you're absolutely right. We all can do one thing. Here is my rallying call for the world, and then I'll narrow it down to what you can do. The rally is we all have to radically reduce the footprint of police officers in the lives of Black and Brown children. And so what can you do to help with that? And my one of many suggestions, but one suggestion is this: all of you should contact your lawmakers and ask them to remove police from schools and provide alternatives for school safety, decriminalize normal adolescent behaviors, things like disturbing schools, and to prohibit the use of force in any and all forms with children. So that's my call to action. Pick up your phone, call your lawmaker.
Thank you, Chris. And Sally, what can we do to support the movement to remove police from schools?
Nationally, wherever you are, look up the youth organizations, the Black youth organizations, the immigrant youth organizations in your area that are working on this, and ask them where they are with their campaigns, where they are on this issue and how to support it. I absolutely echo what Kristen said. Call your lawmakers wherever you are and demand the removal of police from schools. Here in New York City, the current work on the ground is to do that by not just transferring SSAs back to the Department of Ed from NYPD, but to dismantle policing of all kinds in schools. And so you call Mayor de Blasio, who has control of schools. You can call on the mayoral candidates who are running this year and let them know where you stand and where you're hoping they stand on that issue. That's the simplest place to start, I would say.
Thank you, Sally. And Rick, what can we do to empower communities and hold police accountable?
So I would just sort of piggyback and maybe be a little more blunt as to what both Chris and Sally said. And that really is to follow the money. I encourage people to do their homework, to get to know your police operating budget, the police operating budget in your communities, and see how your tax dollars are being spent on law enforcement. See how much money the police is spending, or your city is spending on badge and gun policing, and then compare that to what they're putting into dollars for mental health, for job training, for educational supports, all the other community-based programs. Compare and contrast the amounts of money being spent on badge and gun solutions versus more care and repair solutions, and then dig a little bit deeper and look, as Sally really pointed out, thoroughly. Look at the money that's being spent on policing in your schools, and how much money, particularly, if you're in New York City, just look at how much money is being spent on putting police in schools, and then compare that to what's being spent on textbooks, to what's being spent on laptops, to what's being spent on, bringing art and music into the curriculum. And depending on where you live and how that sort of, plays out, look at other places around the country. Look at Jackson, Mississippi. Look at Detroit. Look at, the Antelope Valley in Southern California, Palmdale or Lancaster, and see what those expenditures are and the ratios of those expenditures for policing in schools versus textbooks or laptops or art and music programs. And then the last thing I would say is pay attention to what the settlement payments are for police misconduct cases in your jurisdiction, and understand whether or not there's a risk management fund associated with those payments. And what that really means is that if there's a risk management settlement fund in your jurisdiction, it means that the cops are not feeling any pain or any responsibility or any financial sting from their misconduct. The money that's being used to pay those settlements is not coming from the police budget. It's coming from a separate fund. So you need to understand whether or not there is, how much are being paid every year in police misconduct cases and violence cases, and then understand whether or not it's even that misconduct is even being felt by the officers who are committing it, or by the police departments that are encouraging it or supporting it, or certainly not punishing it. And really understand that and follow the money. And I think if you do that, and if you look at those kinds of things, you will not be able to be helped to help, but be spurred to action.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thanks to all of you. My own call to action is very similar. When I speak about these issues, sometimes people feel really overwhelmed. They're thinking, my God, there's so much, what can I do? They feel overwhelmed. And what I say is, everybody can't do everything, but everybody can do something. So pick the issue that you care most about. Join the organization that's working on that issue, or donate to that organization. Donate to national organizations that are working on these issues. In most cities, mayors appoint police chiefs. Tell your mayor that you want a police chief that's going to instruct his officers not to racially profile, not to over-police in Black and brown communities, and not to use excessive force, not to use force at all when it comes to youth. Tell your city council or your county council that you want police out of schools. Tell your elected district attorney that you want him or her to hold police accountable when they break the law. We all have a role to play. And I just want to thank again our panelists, and I want to also thank all of you, as well as the Riverside Church Justice Aid, for bringing us together. We can all have a just world if we just work together. So thanks to you all.
As we reach the end of our program, we know that there is much work left for us to do in order to achieve the system that we all deserve. And so it is with that in mind that I leave you with this benediction. Let us not grow weary in well-doing, but instead let us go out and work towards that day when justice truly does roll down like waters and righteousness an ever-flowing stream. For we who believe in freedom, we who believe in justice, we who believe in righteousness, we who believe in fairness and accountability cannot rest until it comes. So let us leave this place and go out into the world and work as though we are the very answers to our own prayers. And may the God of hope be with you on this journey. In the name of love and in the name of justice, go in peace. Amen.
you.